This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, taking a deep dive into issues that shape our lives here in Israel. My guest today has a list of accomplishments that is literally too many to count. Among the many positions that he filled in academia, public service, diplomacy, and politics, he served as Cabinet Secretary, Attorney General, and Deputy Chief Justice until his retirement in 2017. As Cabinet Secretary in Elyakim Rubinstein's government, he was the head of the Israeli delegation to the talks that eventually yielded the peace treaty with the Kingdom of Jordan, whose 30-year anniversary has been marked recently. Professor Elyakim Rubinstein, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
The peace treaty between Israel and Jordan came in the wake of decades of low-level and unofficial cooperation between the two countries, and also as a prelude to a historic reconciliation with the Palestinians that was supposed to come several years later. Now, you had also been involved in the peace negotiations with Egypt some 15 years before, which brought together two bitter enemies, but Jordan and Israel didn't have the same status. Now, did the talks with Jordan feel like you were making history in real time? Or just another box that needed to be checked on the way to a new Middle East?
Well, it was history. One of the aspects of, let's put it, the historical side of the whole thing is the boundary. And maybe we'll talk about it a bit later, but I just want to put your introduction into a historic context. Very few people know that the contact between the Jewish leadership in this country with the Jordanian Hashemite family started back in 1924. It's 100 years. A delegation from Jerusalem, headed by Colonel Kish, who was the head of the political department of the Zionist organization here, grandfather of the Minister of Education in Israel. He was later killed in World War II as a brigadier. People from what was known as the Vaad Leumi, or the National Committee of the Jewish population, and even the chief rabbinate, they went to Amman and met with Abdallah, who had been there just for a couple of years, being installed in Amman as part of the fulfillment of the British commitments in World War I, because they had commitments which were not absolutely compatible with each other. So there was the McMahon correspondence with the Hashemite family. There was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, so it's 1915, 1916, and then the Balfour Declaration, 1917. And they had to reconcile them somehow. So in 1922, under Churchill, as Minister of Colonies, they introduced a resolution to in the League of Nations to cut the eastern side of the Jordan River from the commitments of the Balfour Declaration of the Jewish National Home. Ever since 1924, there were contacts between the Jewish side and between Abdallah, who was then emir, but in 1946 became king. And there were even payments that were for known as options for buying land. In the period before 48, when things started moving towards the Jewish state and so on, the contact still continued. Golda Meir was an emissary to Abdallah, and when she was appointed our envoy to Moscow, it was Moshe Dayan, my original mentor, and Eliyahu Sasson, who went to see Abdallah. It's all around. And interestingly enough, when the armistice negotiations took place in 48 and 49, basically, headed by Ralph Bunche, the UN American envoy, the method with the Jordanians was somewhat similar to what happened in my day, which means there was a delegation in Rhodes doing the negotiations, and there was what Prince Hassan would years later call the safety net, contacts on the top level, or emissaries from our side, like Dayan and Sasson, went to see Abdallah to make sure that there is a harmony in the instructions and so on.
So it wasn't just instrumental from the beginning. The safety net meant that there were things beyond the so-called Staatsräson.
That's correct, but in the early 50s, just a short time before King Abdallah's assassination, here in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Hussein, his grandson, being next to him, there were negotiations between Dayan and Reuven Shiloach, an early diplomat, and the Jordanians, in order to maybe make peace. The Jordanian by then already took over the West Bank and made it into a part of Jordan. But then Abdallah was assassinated. Hussein came to the throne a year thereafter because his father, Talal, who was the king for a short while, had
mental illness,
psychiatric problems, and he was hospitalized in Turkey, I believe, and Hussein was installed as king. It took him some time to settle himself, to send out the British commanders of the Jordanian army. It used to be known as the Legion. And in the early 60s, I think 63, he met for the first time with an envoy from Israel, Dr. Yaakov Herzog, who was the brother of our former President Herzog and the uncle of our current President Herzog. And so this meeting in Paris in 63, he was then, Dr. Yaakov Herzog was the Director General of the Prime Minister's office. It was a beginning of contacts that took place in the next years. For instance, in the late 60s and early 70s, after the Six-Day War already, there were meetings with Golda Meir, with Moshe Dayan, with Rabin, with Abba Eban, the people who were in the helm in Israel in that period. So he knew the Israelis. In fact, when we were walking with Rabin, he mentioned from time to time, and even before that, when Ephraim Halevi and myself became the first envoys, official envoys in 91, he used to talk a lot about history, about his meeting with the king, about American presidents and about problems in the area and so on. and he mentioned that Rabin, he knew Rabin. He didn't know Shamir because we started as envoys of Shamir in 91. Rabin came back to power in 92. In any case, this stopped when Begin came to power for a while. Begin never met Hussein, I believe. Shamir did.
Because as a revisionist, he wasn't willing to recognize the Kingdom of Jordan's legitimacy?
It may be the case. I can't speak for him, but it may be the case. In any case, under him, Dayan met once with Hussein in the summer of 77.
When Dayan was Begin's
foreign minister. Yeah, that's my beginning in a way in the high-level diplomacy.
You were his chief of staff,
I was
right?
his, yeah. And we said chief of staff. The whole staff was two people. So besides,
you need one chief.
Besides secretary, well, chiefs, no Indians, as they say. And personally, I started working in the Jordanian field, which would be for almost a decade. Was in 1986 when I became the cabinet secretary under Shamir. Right away, a couple of weeks after my beginning in that office, I went with Ephraim Halevi and Shmuel Goren, who was then the coordinator of the territory, to meet Jordanians in Europe. It wasn't Hussein, they were top people from the kingdom, and the talks in those days were not on peace treaties or something, but on practical matter in the West Bank. This is before Hussein disconnected in 88 from the West Bank, as you...
And also before the first Intifada started.
And before, and even throughout the first Intifada, and even later. But so we were meeting rather often in Europe to... it was clandestine, obviously.
What sort of things about running the West Bank to do this?
For instance, banks or movement of people, mundane problems that came up. And also, of course, the situation, what's going on around us and so on.
So the talks that you led in 1994 weren't historical in that sense because there weren't a precedent, but you said that there were a precedent or historical in the sense that they set a boundary for the state of Israel for the first time.
I have to go back a little bit. In 91, the American Secretary of State, Jim Baker, was shuttling to establish to prepare what used to be called, or would be called later, the Madrid Conference, which took place in October of 91. I should say in brackets, there was also what's known as the London Agreement between Peres and Hussein. I think this is being over-explained or given more credit than it could deserve, not because there was no goodwill by Peres, but because it included an international conference, which for Shamir was anathema, and through the UN in continuity, as the continuity of the Geneva Conference of 73, and the mere idea that the UN would convince something meant PLO inside. It wasn't mentioned in the documents, but it was obvious. And I think Peres, I can't speak for him, and I was friendly with him, but he thought he wanted the PLO inside, which happened later in 93 in Oslo. But at the time, the ostensible policy was against. Shamir was deadly against. Rabin was dead against at the time.
But also the London Agreement was never ratified by the Israeli cabinet.
No, never came to the cabinet. But not only that, he made a mistake procedurally. he showed Shamir the document and took it back. He said because it may leak. He thought maybe the U.S. would propose it. Shamir leak. Shamir, his name, he wouldn't give out. In any case, throughout the Baker shuttle after the Gulf War, which opened opportunities because Jordan was in a weak situation. They were perceived as supporting Saddam Hussein, and so were the Palestinians. We started, Ephraim Halevi and myself, crossing the river and going to Jordan, starting, I think, in April or May, I forget, 91, to talk to the king and his brother Hassan, who played an important role then and later in the peace negotiations. And we, in a way, established a confidence. I should have mentioned, though, that just before the war, that Shamir met Hussein twice.
Which war? The Gulf War?
The Gulf War. But Shamir, and I attended those two meetings, he met him before the war. Once in 87, there was a meeting, and we thought at the time it would be continued. It didn't. In December 90, just before the Gulf War, Shamir and Hussein met and set, I would say, some red lines between them towards a pending war. And
because they knew a war was coming.
Yeah. And so when we went, Ephraim Halevi and myself, to Jordan a few times, it was on this background. And then came Madrid conference. And the Madrid conference, we insisted there be a combined Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. It was problematic, and in fact, it didn't work that well. The idea of the coupling of Jordanians and Palestinians, but nevertheless, in Madrid, by the way, I made a point to shake the hand of the Jordanian and Palestinian counterparts, Dr. Majali, who was the Jordanian, and he became my friend for life throughout many years, and Dr. Abdel Shafi, the Palestinian from Gaza. Both are now unfortunately deceased, but with him also, on a personal level, we had good contacts. On the diplomatic level, it was tough for the Palestinians. It was much more positive and friendly with the Jordanians. So then we start in Washington for 2 years of negotiations. And with Jordan, the fruit, I leave aside the Palestinians for a minute because we talk about Jordan. We had to, I'll only say that we had to carve a procedural arrangement which made me sit on a couch for 2.5 weeks in the corridor of the State Department between the Jordanian, and that's the picture there, the Jordanian and Palestinian counterpart, because they wouldn't enter the negotiating room until we agreed on procedure, and they wanted to separate. And we insisted on being together. So we had an arrangement which we basically had 2 tracks, but in each track, the other side, the Arab side, would also be part.
Why was it so difficult to agree on procedural matters?
Because we had the Madrid framework, which spoke of a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. And we saw it also in the historical context because we believed at the time, and now I see that people come back to it, we believed that the permanent status will include Jordan and the Palestinians together, or some kind of a confederation or something similar. And in the spirit of Camp David of 78, which we didn't talk about, but has a framework on the autonomy for Palestinians, and it includes in the wider frame the Jordanians also in the permanent status negotiations. So here we are in Washington for 2 years, and while with the Palestinians there was little progress made because they were in a difficult situation. Those negotiators, the PLO was there and wasn't in the room, but
So the Palestinian issue was the elephant in the room with the Jordanians?
no.
So there were many other details to iron out?
Of course, I'm coming to that. Of course, it was there, but the Jordanians, since they've disconnected in '88, they really wanted to take care of their own interests in particular. And the result...
So just to say that in 1988, the king declared that he had no more interest in the West Bank as opposed to before.
That's up to the PLO, he said, because there was the Rabat conference in '74. It's not going to it now. I think he did it because of the first Intifada. In any case, the fruit of the negotiations in Washington was an agreement known as the Common Agenda between Israel and Jordan. And there's a picture up there, me signing it with my second counterpart, also to become later Prime Minister of Jordan, Dr. Faiz Taraone. Unfortunately, he's also deceased now. And that was basically the headlines or the skeleton of the next stage of the peace negotiations. This we signed one day after Oslo in Washington, although we had it initialed clandestinely almost a year earlier, but the Jordanians didn't want to be the first. So it was kept in the refrigerator for a year, and when Oslo erupted and it basically bypassed our delegation in Washington, I had nothing to do with Oslo, but the Jordanians, when Oslo was going to be signed, agreed to publicly sign, even then they call it initial, but publicly sign the agenda agreement. So this is September of 1993. And then for a few months, there was, I would say the shock was still around, the Oslo shock. But ever since, and I should say that Rabin wanted to keep to keep the relations with Hussein just a couple of weeks after Oslo and the agenda was signed, day after the other. Rabin came to see Hussein in Amman. I attended the meeting with him.
And what were the issues that they were discussing? What was it?
Explaining what Oslo was.
Mm-hmm. So the Palestinian issue was the elephant in the room in the negotiation with the Jordanians all along.
Peres used to say yes and no. It is a sort of yes and no. Yes, of course, it was in the background, but the Jordanians had the boundary and the water and security and other things to worry about from their own point of view.
Were there big differences between the Israeli view on those issues, on boundaries and water and security, and the Jordanian ones?
The main challenge was boundary, and I'll explain why. And thank God we got a good agreement, but good means both sides were basically happy.
You're saying that as a judge as well?
Also.
Yeah.
But also as a person with common sense. People say that an agreement, either both sides should be happy, that's the preferred thing, or both should be unhappy. If one side is happy and the other one is unhappy, the chances of the agreement to sustain are much smaller, much less. Basically, at the end of 93 or the beginning of 94, and more so throughout the first half of 94, we started again with the Jordanians after the shock of Oslo. And I personally resigned from working on the Palestinians after Oslo.
You're saying the shock of Oslo because you didn't know it was coming.
Nor did the Jordanians.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know, but the Jordanians didn't know, and therefore for them it was quite shocking. I was asked by Rabin in 5 conversations to continue, at least in the Jordanian track. Rabin, by the way, inherited me, not only I was Shamir's cabinet secretary. I left to be deputy attorney general, and 2-3 weeks later, I got this phone call from Rabin, please come back for 3 months. It became 2 years. In the beginning, by the way, the U.S., in the first few months, after almost not being involved in the negotiations in Washington or in a very low profile, here they tried to raise the profile, and we had trilateral meeting, U.S., Jordan, Israel. But soon the things became bilateral, with the U.S. hovering somewhere there, trying to help if needed.
So I want you to speak about the boundaries, and you said that it was pretty contentious.
So just to mention that from in July 94, we moved the negotiations from Washington to the area, and the beginning was in a tent in the Arava, just for a couple of days. And the Jordanians wanted to show that they are being recognized by Israel, and there have been boundary negotiations in the boundary area. So we had this tent negotiations. I said in my speech, the tent is tentative, but peace will be permanent. So, and then we started accelerating the negotiations towards a treaty of peace. And from basically in July, after the 10th, a couple of days later, Rabin signed with the king in Washington what's known as the Washington Declaration of July 25th, I think, 1994. And also, a day before that, Peres met Peres' foreign minister. To be honest, Rabin didn't want him to be too much into Jordanian negotiations. And so he was there, but he wanted to be more. So Peres met with Majali, who was by then already prime minister, on the other side of the Jordan, for the first time, open meetings on the other side. And in the early meetings, I went with a wig, because I was known publicly as cabinet secretary. So I went with a wig and a mustache to not to be identified.
Boundaries. Why was it such a contentious issue?
So here we are. The boundary was never demarcated. It was basically based on a British decision which was brought to the League of Nations 92, and it was a verbal, written definition saying 2 miles from Aqaba, center of Wadi Araba, center of the Dead Sea, center of the Jordan, till the meeting with the Yarmouk, it raised problems. Only 4 kilometers were demarcated near Eilat, near Aqaba. Eilat didn't exist in 1946. And there was another definition, which was the lower points. And since the late 60s, Israeli governments allowed the Arava villages, kibbutzim, moshavim, the agricultural villages of the Arava to cultivate land on the other side of the armistice line, because there was a good land which was barren, never worked. And by the time we were negotiating the Treaty of Peace in 94, 50% of the land that the Arava settlements were were cultivating, was on the other side of the... And it was, if we go back to the armistice, which was never agreed or declared as a boundary, half the economy of the Arava would be ruined, destroyed. And we didn't want that to happen. And on the other hand, Rabin had a wish to finish, because he wanted to show results. We consulted with experts, Professor Braver, Big Arab, some, and Lauterpacht, and we concluded that when we speak of Wadi Arava, there is no one Wadi, a river, which goes between Eilat and the Dead Sea, and Wadi Arava must be the valley of Arava, which is between what's known as the African Syrian break, rift. So the whole thing is called the Arava Rift. So we had to be creative. Mm-hmm. And we developed a theory, which I think was right, basically, that it is the valley. If it is the valley, we could have the boundary about a few kilometers to the east. And that would solve our problem. But the Jordanians insisted, from their comfortable point of view, on the armistice line. So what was the creative agreement? And that took those months, was an exchange of territory. We agreed to the armistice line, subject to about 40 square kilometers, which is quite a number, being basically exchanged. So we gave them barren land on our side, and we got in our sovereignty, the cultivated land of all the Arava settlements, with one exception, so far. Why so far? Because the land they were cultivating were too much inside Jordan, 6 kilometers or something, and the Jordanians didn't want. And by the way, in the agreement, we didn't say we are exchanging land and so on. We just said the boundary is per the attached aerial photos. And that's what we did.
Was that a prelude to later suggestions of land swaps between Israelis and Palestinians? And
well,
did you give the idea? Did you come up with the idea?
Not at the time. There were people who were working on these ideas, but at the time, the Jordanians, by the way, they wanted us to give them not one-on-one the exchange, but what the Saudis got from them, or gave them, I think got from them, when the Saudis gave them land on the coast of Aqaba, they took 5 times land slots in the desert. So we told the Jordanians, no, we don't have that much possibility, one-on-one. And there was another point known as Naharaim in the north, where by, I think, a mistake or something in the armistice, a few thousand dunams, what's on a few square kilometers, stayed on our side, although they are east of the Jordan River. And and so when peace comes, we said to them, look, it may be yours, but it's after 46 years. Why shouldn't we do something to help the kibbutzim in the north? There are 3 kibbutzim that were using that land, 2 Ashdod Yaakov, Ichud Meuchad, and Gesher. So the king agreed to a special regime, like a lease, for 25 years with Jordanian sovereignty, but cultivating, and there was also hopes for tourism in that area. For 25 years, I drafted the 20, and then Tzofar was added to the same concept of a special regime. As somebody who drafted this, I can tell that it's a pity that we lost in it. The agreement says it will be automatically renewed for additional periods, which means it should have continued.
These lands were given back after 25 years.
And that's what I'm sorry about.
So this brings me to my next question. I want to
Please.
Go back to what you said about the tent and peace, and the tent being tentative and peace being permanent. Peace with Jordan continues to this day. It is, I'm sure you agree, a major strategic asset for the state of Israel.
And for them.
And for them as well. And it survived despite the many upheavals that the region has known, also between Israelis and Palestinians, but also in the wider region. Do you take credit for its endurance and survival skills?
The credit goes to Prime Minister Shamir and mainly to Prime Minister Rabin, and I'm proud to be part of the agreement. I think for me personally, I had a rather interesting professional life for over 50 years. But for me, it's the most significant part. Although I was on the Supreme Court, I was the Attorney General, and I was at Camp David with Begin, and I think I'm now maybe the only person who attended the negotiation with all our 5 neighbors, Syria, Lebanon, of course, Jordan, Palestinians, and Egypt. But 2 points that I wanted to make, one is on water and one is security. In the peace, the Jordanians wanted water. They are always short of water. Now it's better for our situation because we have desalination plants and so on. They didn't exist as much at the time. So we have a rather complicated water agreement, and we've been supplying them for many years, and even more than in the agreement, as I understand. The other thing is that it was my suggestion originally, I think, to Rabin. We suggested that the security relations will be without any third party. No UNDOF, UNIFIL, MFO, all of that. We will deal with them directly. And I think this is important to mention because today, as far as I know, the military and strategic relations with Jordan are much more than we would like to have on the civilian side. They are I think the pillar of the relations.
Does that make you hopeful that the relations would survive?
First of all, there are interests. I don't think that from what I read in the media, I don't think there's very much chemistry in the highest level between the 2 countries. But the interests are there. And I'm one of those who have been supporting augmenting the relations with Jordan, and I've been involved in various ways. And I wrote about it I have a column in the newspaper. But They also have to behave. I mean, their foreign minister is defaming us all the time in a very unbecoming way. But there is a strategic interest. Personally, I should mention, I was also involved in the implementing agreements, and we were hoping, learning from the mistakes in the past with Egypt and so on, that here we will have a real good, positive civilian relations. This didn't happen as we were hoping, but I'm still hopeful because maybe when things stabilize, I'm not. Nobody is a prophet, and the complex situation hasn't been solved. But I'm hopeful that the interest of both countries would lead us also to civilian cooperation.
All right. Professor Elyakim Rubinstein, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the generous support.